All right, here we go. All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right, we're going to keep going. Good morning. My name's Linda McElwee. I work with the Mendocino County Resource Conservation District. Hopefully you can hear me, and I'm coming through clear, loud and clear, without, okay, great. Good morning. The Mendocino County Resource Conservation District, who I work for, we work on a voluntary basis with landowners related to soil and water and forests. So we're going to be talking this morning. I'm super excited to be here, and I live here in the Anderson Valley in Boonville, and I've been working in the Navarro watershed, working on salmon recovery. I'm a newcomer, so I came in 2000, so I'm only halfway, but I feel a little bit like I've grown up with AVA to a certain AV Winegrowers, and seeing the vineyards evolve here and getting to learn about the farming practices and the farmers. And I'm really excited to be going back in history and also looking to the future in this morning panel. We do have a very packed agenda, so we're going to just keep moving through this whole day, hopefully this whole morning session. And I'm not going to have a whole bunch of time here. This is going to be it in terms of introducing my guests. So I'm going to let them do their own introductions to a certain degree. But I do want to, these gentlemen here, do not need much of an introduction, but just to say that Zac Robinson and Norman Kobler. Zac is from Husch Vineyards, and Norman from Farrington Vineyards and Philo Vineyard Solutions, have been, for me, very important allies in learning about watershed health and the fisheries and farming. And we're kind of, we'll be hearing a little bit later, after rooting ourselves in the history, we're going to learn from Chris Chen around the vineyard practices and how they have evolved. And then we're going to talk some soils with Miguel from Napa RCD. Seth Myrick is going to talk some more about some funding opportunities from the Mendocino County Resource Conservation District. We have Laurel Marcus from Fish Friendly Farming going to talk about fisheries and coho salmon and fish friendly farming. And Monty Schmidt from the Nature Conservancy is going to be talking about stream flow enhancement and some projects that we've been working on with the vineyards to restore coho recovery in the watershed. So farming and fish, we have a unique opportunity here in the Navarro watershed. With that, I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves. I consider you native sons here of the valley, and Norman in particular. Your parents were early settlers and development, and your uncle. Grandfather, Tony, was a pioneer. Yeah. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you guys to tell us a little bit about your story and the roots here of Anderson Valley. Thanks so much for being here.
Not yet. Here's probably out to test yours. Are we good still?
Okay.
Zac Robinson, I'm with Husch Vineyards. My family's been farming in Mendocino County since the 50s and in the Anderson Valley since 1977. We're going to chat very casually right now, Norm and I, about farming in the Anderson Valley before it was Anderson Valley, or at least before it was an appellation.
Is this okay? As it works. Yeah. So just a quick history for me. My parents bought their first place here in the valley in '72, which is known as the Dash Ranch, which is now owned by Rotor. And then my parents started Lazy Creek Vineyards in 1973. So I've been here since then. Went through school here and pretty much raised here in the valley.
On our first slide here, we're looking at an old map of the Anderson Valley. I'm not expecting you to see all of your landmarks in this map, but look at the purple there. This purple shows 1938, that we were already an agricultural area. The red lines, by the way, are the Appalachian boundaries, and that big blob of purple is where we are sitting right now. That is the Boonville area. And as you start looking to the left in this map, you see all these additional blobs of purple going all the way up the valley past Philo in this particular map. We've been farming in this region for a long time. Not necessarily grapes. Grapes came along a little bit later. But we're going to focus on this era before the appellation, the old days of farming. And just to kick it off, we're going to start here with a list of some names. These are the vineyards, and not even the wineries. I didn't put any of the wineries down here. These are the vineyards that got things started. Very much right at this place we're talking right now, because Boonville was the epicenter of farming in the Anderson Valley before the wineries showed up. Norm and I have been talking about some of these locations, and if anyone has any stories about what they remember from these locations, we'd love to hear more afterwards. So with that said, we're going to jump into our first photo here, and this is the format for the rest of our chat. We're going to look at a couple of photos, and we're going to talk about what it is we see and how it is that that connects to the history of the Anderson Valley. So this first photo is 1970. This is a fresh planting of a vineyard in the Philo area. And when I look at this photo, I see one wire. Trellising was kind of a new concept back then. And so in this particular case, there's a single fruit wire on a wooden stake. What's interesting, though, is we're looking at new technology that allowed grape growing to advance in Anderson Valley. And what I'm talking about there is a sprinkler system, overhead sprinklers. Because for the longest of times in the Anderson Valley, we were bedeviled by frost events. Want to share a thought on that?
Yeah. Basically, I mean, yeah, my dad didn't know much when he started. Basically, he was thinking about the spacing the size of his tractor. He had a tractor, an old crawler, basically, steel tracks, and a blade in front, and the blade was 6 feet wide, and he figured 8 feet he can get through. So that was the old-time method for him, just thinking about what equipment he could get through. And then also talking about the frost events, the next slide, you want to go to the next slide, or is it too early?
We can bounce back and forth.
Okay. The next slide, that is actually the old Lazy Creek Vineyard at the Pinot Ranch. That's was in 1974, I think it was, when that picture was taken. And you can see in the upper part of that slide, there is some, you can see like an old vineyard. And that is part of the old Zinfandel vineyard from Pinoli's. I'm not sure the year it was planted, but maybe somewhere around the early 20s, somewhere around in there. And Johnny Pinoli, when we used to talk with him, said there was no frost protection. He had several frost events, which no frost protection or anything, and they finally gave up on that site in, I think it was early 60s, because there was too many frost events and they could never harvest any fruit. So like what you're saying, frost is a big thing here in the valley, and you need frost protections, not every year, but I think it goes in cycles. And there was a cycle in the 60s where there was a lot of frost events.
That also partially explains why viticulture was established and certainly holding on tight in the hills above the Anderson Valley, but on the valley floor, it was challenging. We were challenged by frost events. We were challenged by access to marketplaces. Let's say you were able to ripen a crop in 1950. Who was going to buy it, and how were you going to get it there? These were big challenges when you were growing grapes in the Boonville area in the 1950s.
Yeah, my dad was also thinking about selling fruit in the early stages, and there was very few buyers. Parducci was the main name that was basically brought up, but there was no wineries here in the valley, so you had to go out of the valley to be able to sell any fruit from the valley at all.
I'm going to jump back to this other photo. With these wooden stakes, they have a backstory of their own, I've learned. So Anderson Valley has a long logging history. And so when it was time to get wooden stakes, there was all kinds of local sources. Guys would say, oh yeah, I can split you some stakes. What they didn't say is how they were going to do that. What they would do is they would go to other folks' properties and look for the logging butts. What these are large pieces of fallen tree that were cut down by the loggers maybe as much as 100 plus years ago. But that first 10, maybe 20 feet of the trunk was considered to not be usable, so it was left in place. So you would have these giant rounds of old growth redwood just lying around on people's properties. So these guys who could provide you with grapevine stakes would figure out where these logging butts were lying, come in the middle of the night. Now you might think of this as, oh, well, they were reusing, recycling, something like that. Another word might be poaching. But that is where many of those original stakes in the Anderson Valley came from, the logging butts.
I know that's where my dad got his, so.
Yeah, exactly.
20 acres worth, yep.
Brad, yeah.
Zac, where exactly is that photo? Is that Husch Vineyard?
Yeah, that's a picture at Husch looking back over what's now Black Kite.
Yeah, that's what I thought, down looking west toward the river.
Exactly. You know, the other thought too, when you look at these wooden stakes, you know, why weren't we putting more wires on our stakes? We were trying to build trellises, right? We were moving away from the old days of individually planted vines that were head trained. But think of it this way. You've got a stake, you got to put a wire on it. How are you going to do that? Turns out that was kind of hard. We didn't have screwdriver drills. So you were out there with a hammer. How do you hammer a nail or maybe a staple onto a freestanding wooden stake? So then you got to put in your other hand a big counterweight, and you're trying to hit the nail into the stake with a hammer in one hand, maybe the head of a sledge in the other hand, and not smash your fingers and not knock the stake over. So even a commitment to a single wire was kind of a big deal. You know, the one other thing I noticed in this, everyone can see the sheep, certainly the sheep on the open fields there. And the other thing, there were no timberable trees in these photos. And that was very much the story of the Anderson Valley. At this era, there were 35 mills in the valley. So anything that had a straight trunk, that was cut down. So all the trees that were left were usually these oak trees, more or less on property lines, because with 35 hungry mills, most of the other trees were cut down.
Yeah, my dad, basically, that's where he started to supplement the income until we really got going. He worked at the mill. There's quite a few of the old-timer, Brad, and my dad, and Sam Prather, and a bunch of the old-timers had to make a little extra income, and the mill was a huge labor or a huge job for the valley, and a lot of the old timers worked there.
So if you can imagine this, there's these guys working in the mill, working the green chain, a lot of them was their role. Dangerous job. And what it seems they were chatting about on their breaks was, how are we going to grow grapes here in the Anderson Valley? And it's kind of a funny evolution if you think of it that way. This wasn't happening in coffee shops or in Davis. This was happening at the local sawmill. How many years did your dad work there, do you think?
I think it was about 2 to 3 years, not very long, but yeah. So this is basically also at Lazy Creek. The old way, basically, no gondolas, no plastic micro bins. It was all in the old wooden boxes. So it was all hand-loaded onto the trailer, hand-loaded off, dumped into the crusher. A lot more hand work and just the old way. I mean, it gave you a lot more appreciation, I think, for the fruit back then, because it was all your own labor. You're all dumping into you always watched it, leaves and everything. You always took good care of it.
So let's say you had a vineyard and you were going 4 tons to the acre. Can you imagine how many of these wooden picking boxes you would have to fill per acre? It's just nuts that they were able to get through a harvest on even a smaller plot, much less 10 acres or even bigger than that. Box by box. And I think that was all inherited from the apple growers. I know certainly all of the fruit boxes, you would spray paint over, or probably brush paint over the apple box logo and put your own vineyard logo on top of that.
The old Del Monte one was definitely on a lot of boxes.
I think even though we look at these apple boxes and say, well, that was the old way of picking grapes, I think it was somewhat new to Anderson Valley, though, because this was really starting to think about farming on a smaller scale and doing higher quality fruit, getting closer to the fruit. Because we know that the vineyards that were growing fruit here in the Boonville era, 1960s-esque, were still picking the gondolas. We're still hoping to get their fruit down to the Italian Swiss colony or maybe over to Ukiah at the Parducci winery. And that was very much a game of, I know my grapes aren't quite ripe enough, but I'm going to put the really ripe stuff on top, and they're never going to see what's underneath, and we're going to get it by them. And it's almost unimaginable to think about today, but back then you would get paid bonus for fruit that was above 22 bricks or maybe 23 bricks. You would actually get extra money because everyone knew you were trying to pick at 21 to make your life easy and to get a little bit of extra crop off the field and certainly to get your fruit picked before it started to rain.
Yeah, talking about the Italian Swiss colony, I remember in the mid '70s going to school, and you could still see the actual rows. They already had rootstock at that point, but you could see the old rows where the rootstocks would be coming up through the whole baseball field, school area, and even the airport. You can see the old rows, but now they're pretty much all gone. But you can still see them back in the '70s, and those were wide rows, like you're saying. You could see how wide everything was then.
This is a harvest photo, and I threw this one in here because just thinking about what our trellising was at the time. You know, isn't the whole point of a trellis to kind of control your growth and put your grapevines into some sort of an organized fashion so that we can ripen our fruit all in one fruit zone? Well, look at these giant masses of grapevines here. This is what you get with only one wire. You can see it's grapevine all the way from the soil all the way up to about 6 feet high. The other thing that you can see here is, do you see that sharp edge in the background between what looks like, just dry grass or prairie and then the edge of the forest? Much of our farmland was in fact clear cut out of the redwood forest when it was originally converted from forest to sheep. And so this was the era when the loggers would come in and we could cut down pretty big trees with our long bladed saws, but we didn't have the equipment to mill up that wood on site. And we didn't even have fossil fuel driven tractors to kind of clean things up on site. So what we did instead was we felled the wood and then we waited for the hottest day of the summer and then we lit it on fire. Makes perfect sense, right? But what you achieved by doing that approach was that you were able to burn most of the slash away, the economically valuable redwood trunks. You know, some of these things 20 feet wide, those would survive the fire just fine. And better yet, you laid down this nice layer of ash, which is going to sprout up into the grasses the next year, where you're going to graze your sheep. And so the majority of our farmland in Anderson Valley was born with this technique. So Norm, what did we do with the stumps? Because we still had stumps in the field.
Yeah, stumps were a big problem, and there's only one way to get them sky high, and that's with the dynamite. Yeah, there were a lot of the old barns, still had some of the old boxes. I think I remember seeing some of the old barns, some of the dynamite boxes still there from when they cleared Pinot Place. And when they were ripping, there was like not a redwood tree in sight, but you'd pull up a redwood root every once in a while. So you know the redwoods were there. I know when they built a pond, they had some big roots that came up, and 100% redwood root, there's no doubt about it. And so it just shows you how the valley has changed throughout the years, and these grasslands that are there now are most likely from the early settlers who cleared it out, like Zach's saying, and opened it up and had sheep. I remember in the beginning there was close to 5,000 sheep here in the valley, and now I think we're maybe a couple thousand, if that. So definitely it's changed.
It's funny you mention Pinot there because I've heard that name mentioned more than once as the local source when you needed a couple sticks of dynamite. He was well stocked.
Maybe about 5 minutes.
Perfect.
This is part of the old Lazy Creek. In that shed that you see straight in the back of there, there was an old redwood tank, probably around 2,000-gallon tank in there. And that was their original bootlegging tank. And to the left of the picture is a cellar underground with slabs of redwood, or about like 4 inches thick by almost 2 feet wide, dug into the ground. It made like about a 15 by 15 foot cellar. And that was actually one of the first bonded wineries in the valley. I think my dad, I couldn't find it, but I think my dad still has one of the envelopes where it had the bond was in there. It had an old must pump, hand must pump, like a 2-inch pipe, and it was the big wooden stick was still in there when we got there. But they hadn't made anything for probably 15 or 20 years before we got there. And here, my dad's still moving around the old boxes and dumped them into the crusher there, the old style.
And to me, this looks a little bit high-tech already because I know in the early days of Husch, we had a hand crusher and we had a very trusty 2x4 that we used to kind of help the grapes get through the crusher. And so those were the jobs on the crush pad. One guy had to turn the crank and the other guy had to get on the 2x4 and keep things moving along. Oops, upside down. This is a photo from the 1970s, and it shows that, well, things were starting to advance. We now have 2 wires put up on those wooden stakes. We're starting to evolve a trellis. This photo happens to be at Husch at Well, but I think it might represent what everyone else was thinking too. Let's get more control. And if you stop and think about it, this additional wire, which is put, it looks like about 12, 18 inches above the fruiting wire, what is one more wire going to help? We normally like to have a couple more wires to trap the shoots. Well, in that era, when A, it's hard to nail a wire to your stakes, and B, wire's expensive, the idea was we'll take those shoots, we'll crisscross them, and then trap them in the wire up high. So we'll save ourselves having to put additional wires up there by essentially weaving our shoots. And this is how those vines were actually trained every spring, particularly on the Chardonnay, where you had nice, strong shoot growth at the end.
You're talking about the wires too. The top of the stake is a lot easier to pound in a U-nail too.
You bet. I think some here might recognize where this photo was taken. This is a photo actually from the early 80s. And this is not a vineyard, by the way, but it really, I wanted to put this in because it gives me a reminder of Anderson Valley was kind of a messy, maybe even a dirty place back in that era. Maybe you want to talk about the teepee burners?
Well,
You'd drive down the road and basically all of that logging waste would be burned in what were called teepee burners. And you can still see some of the remains of these teepee burners. In fact, there's a couple still standing in the valley. But if you can imagine that just all of the slash from the logging was thrown into the teepee burners, set on fire, and they'd be running these fires 24/7. So the air in the Anderson Valley, without the assistance of wildfires, was pretty darn smoky in those early years. And some of those early frost nights didn't help.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I came to Philo Mills, still had their big burner going. It pretty much was 24 hours a day because it would burn throughout the night. All the sawdust would be piling up in there, and it'd just be smoldering all day. And there's still one standing up at Frank's Firewood. That one is still pretty much all intact.
When do you think the last time they burned in it was?
I don't know. It's been a long time.
For the better.
Yeah.
On the frost nights, I'm thinking of the fact that in those early days, if you didn't have your overhead sprinklers, you of course had your smudge pots. And these are just nasty diesel little chimneys that you'd put out in the field. And the idea wasn't necessarily to generate heat, but to circulate the air. And so those frost mornings when you would have those cold inversions were particularly nasty in this area. Literally soot would be falling from the sky, either from the teepee burners or diesel smoke would be choking you out from the smudge pots.
And fans, all those stuff came later, except I think Brad Wiley has one of the first original fans ever, and I think it should be put in a museum, but it's still standing. Collector's item, yeah.
You're ahead of your time, Brad.
Ford straight eight motor, no muffler, no nothing. 3 o'clock in the morning, something.
Your
Well,
time's up.
you guys want to wrap up? And
Just to thank you. Thanks for looking for these old photos with us and putting up with us, sharing some recollections about how things used to be done. I'd say we've made some progress in the last 40, 50 years.
Oh, yeah, I think a lot of progress. I mean, through all the erosion control and all that, and helping the rivers hopefully go a little bit back to normal, the way they used to be. It's great seeing all these new faces and new techniques that are coming to the valley.
thank you so much. We could sit here all day and listen to these stories, and I hope they continue to keep coming all day.
I just can't even begin to start telling stories because they'll just go on all morning and all afternoon, and that's not good enough. But I was part of, for example, the salvage operation out in Masonite Corporation, who are my adjacent property owners. And Bill Witherell, the old logger in Navarro, taught me how to go out there and do salvage. And it was not just the stumps, it was also the tops of trees. Very often the old timers left the top 20 foot of a redwood that might be 3 and 4 feet on the 3 and 4 feet in width. And Bill Witherell taught me how to go out there with a checker and a bunch of wedges and make boards and throw them in the pickup, bring them back to the farm, and then split them up and make 2x2 grape stakes. I still have some in use in my vineyard. 1976, when I planted Riesling on 2 acres, I used grape stakes. They were treated, but 46 years later, none of them have ever broken off. Old growth redwood grape stakes, they last forever. And that's a real treasure. And yeah, it was a salvage operation and a lot of fun. A lot of fun. It's an art. Making split stuff is an art and a craft, and it's a very satisfying skill to have.
Thanks.
That's enough for today.
Thank you so much. If anybody has a chance to sit down with Brad Wiley today, find Brad and let's hear some more stories and share more stories. Thank you.